what do we want to do? Well, we want to support the co-creative advancement and the progress of the German think tank landscape. And how do we want to do that? We have three working pillars. The first pillar is what we call a community of practice. This is where we want to strengthen peer learning and cooperation in, but also between think tanks. We want to kick off a discussion, bring think tanks together and talk about the common challenges that think tanks face. And today is one of these discussions that we're going to have. The second pillar is a think tank school that we've launched. And in this think tank school, we offer trainings to think tank employees and give opportunities for them to expand the skill set. And last but not least, we will also be developing a think tank toolbox, a place where we will collect all the good practices that we've come across over the last 3 years, over the 3 years of our project, where we will test new approaches and where we will crowdsource the good practices and make them available for think tankers online. If you're interested in our work, don't hesitate to follow us on Twitter or visit our website, www.thinktanklab.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. But now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our two speakers. We've got two fantastic speakers from the policymaking world, and I think also from interesting parts of this universe. One from the political parliamentary side, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff. Graf Lambsdorff has started out as a career diplomat, if I'm not mistaken. He then was a member of the European Parliament from 2004 to 2017. He was vice president of the European Parliament and headed the national delegation of the Free Democrats, the FDP. Since 2017, he is a member of the German Bundestag and vice president of the parliamentary group there, focusing on an issue that is very, very topical these days, foreign policy and international relations. So he has his hands full, and I'm really pleased that we were able to win him for our discussion today. And on the other side, we have somebody from, well, I think I can call it the policy-making machine room. Britta Jacob is a desk officer at the foreign policy planning staff at the Foreign Ministry. And prior to that, she was a foreign policy advisor to various members of parliament. She worked for the Munich Security Conference. And of course, she was a senior foreign policy advisor to the leadership of the German Green Party, Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck, both of whom have now become ministers. This is going to be a little bit of an untraditional event, maybe. We are going to do an Ask Me Anything interview style discussion. We got a lot of questions prior to this event. We got more than 40 questions. We've collected them, we've sorted them, and we've structured them in three basic themes. The first one is going to look at what role think tanks play in your work. The second is going to be at how you use think tank products. And last but not least, we'll be looking at the impact that think tanks have. And then we'll open the floor. This will be around 25, 35 minutes that we'll discuss. And then we'll open the floor for further discussions, which you can put down in the chat, or you just raise your hand and we'll give the floor to you as a speaker. Now, let me start with just two icebreaker questions. The first one to you, Graf Lambsdorff. In your political career, do you remember the first time when you were in touch with a think tank, the first time a think tank approached you? What was it like, and how has it changed your relationship to think tanks back then to now?
Well, in a way, I'm a bit in an awkward position because I went to graduate school in Washington, D.C., and this was in the 90s. And in the 90s, there was a think tank landscape all over the place that was a paradise for policy wonks. I mean, you could go anywhere, everywhere. You saw old and established think tanks like Carnegie or Brookings. There were startups popping up like New America Foundation. You had the very partisan or ideological ones like Cato or AEI. I mean, I grew up really even before joining the Foreign Office being aware of this immense variety, the depth of thinking that was going on. Also, sometimes, of course, the spin that was put onto certain topics coming from think tanks. So when I joined the Foreign Office, then I joined the policy planning staff, where Britta is now, and that was in the mid-90s. And of course, there in policy planning, we have there's one interface really with the think tank community, and we had regular contacts there in policy planning. And I think the first serious political interaction was when we negotiated the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe in 1999. So I've been around a while, as you can tell from my examples. But that was really when, for example, Gerald Knaus and his European Stability Initiative, people like this came up and delivered ideas and products, and they were integrated into our work at policy planning. So for me, this entire universe is one that I appreciate a great deal and that I've profited from enormously.
You mentioned the policy planning staff is something that, where you really got in touch with think tanks and were working with them. Britta, when was the last time you were in touch with a think tank? I mean, this week already, and what was it about?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's almost as Alexander Graf Lambsdorff just said, basically every day, I would say. Maybe not in a variety of activity levels, I would say, but basically on a daily basis, be it with people on the phone, be it responding to invitations and initiatives, but also, and that is, I think, really crucial, we are a team here, a policy planning team, so different colleagues covering different areas of expertise. And of course, they also are in contact very much with think tanks and their products, and they share it with us, of course, and their opinion. They say, hey, look, I have found this new piece, and what do you think? My assessment is this and that, and what do you think about it? So basically, we have an internal debate, let's say, within our team on various issues and aspects almost every day via email or in person. And then there's the direct contact, of course, as someone from policy planning with the colleagues in think tanks every day. But I would say, like me personally, I invited to a roundtable discussion that was kind of a closed door roundtable shortly after the invasion in Ukraine began. So I gathered a few experts from several think tanks to just give us their assessment, their opinions. What are the consequences of this war, of this invasion for Europe in the realm of economy, of security, of energy? And that was really, really valuable, because you just could now hear and cover basically so many aspects that it's not just about that war, but it's about the broader picture and what's going on in Europe. And so just to get a little food for thought and input that we could then share again within our team, that is really, really valuable. So basically every day.
Wow. Graf Lambsdorff, you explained how you got to know think tanks in the beginning and then were working with them in the policy planning staff. How do you work with think tanks today? What role do think tanks play in your work?
Well, I'm in a different role now, of course. I was a junior diplomat when I started out. I was the one who received the papers and had to see, to read them myself and go through them. And analyze them and prepare them from my superiors. Now I have the big advantage that my staff does that for me. But when there are ideas that are really brilliant and that seep into our discussions and debates, sometimes you recognize because they occur at several points in various debates. And then they take on a life of their own. And sometimes it's even no longer traceable which think tank actually developed the idea, because it becomes commonplace. I think that's the most successful contribution you can make when an idea takes on a life of its own. My most recent example, and I think also one of the most powerful ones really, is if you look at, for example, the Munich Security Conference. They have turned from a mere conference, a platform, into an organization that also does think tank work. And if you think of Wolfgang Ischinger's idea of the 3%, rather than focusing just on the military expenditure of 2% of GDP, as committed to in the Wales conclusions, Ischinger and his people came up with 3% for diplomacy, development, and defense, and that's now in the coalition agreement. I mean, this is as powerful as it gets, really, for a think tank idea to become really the formal basis of government policy. And there you have one example that I think has really been developed by a think tank, B, taken on a life of its own, and C, turned into a real policy vector, if you want.
You said one thing in the beginning that I thought was really interesting and goes into one of the questions that we got also from one of the participants. You said when you were studying in the States, you got to know all these think tanks, and you also saw think tanks that had a certain spin on them.
Yeah.
So the question would be, how do you decide which think tanks, which experts to trust? And how do you build a relationship with them?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the most, I think the funniest example of a spin is the American Enterprise Institute's Margaret Thatcher Center for European Studies. I mean, that's as counterintuitive as it gets, because they were pretending to be engaging in European affairs, but what they were really up to was supporting the Tories in their anti-European thing. And there are some think tanks in Germany where I sometimes wonder whether they the name and their real intentions actually match. How do we interact? I mean, the one thing I think that's really useful is various conferences. The German Marshall Fund, for example, a couple of years ago, well, 10 years ago, I think, started the Brussels Forum. This was extremely useful. It was like a small version of Munich, much more informal, very interesting sessions, very good people coming to Brussels, always on the eve of a European Council. And there are even smaller formats. For example, the SWP and Brookings together have a thing that's like 30 people around the table, just foreign policy maker, the political directors of the various foreign offices from the United States, UK, Germany, a couple of academics, a couple of MPs. That's it, like 30 people. That's where interaction becomes really interesting, because it's a toing and froing. And so that's the kind of formats that I like. I also like the conferences organized by NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. From Estonia down to Romania, they have these conferences, and really bright people come there. And you get to know also the perspective of the think tanks from Warsaw, from Riga, etc. That's really, I find that very interesting, not to focus only on your own national think tanks, but also to talk to people. I mean, Natalie Tocci is, of course, one of the biggest stars in Europe, in the think tank landscape. And it's through her work that we all, got to know the Istituto di Affari Internazionali in Rome very well. So these are the ways I interact. That's just me. That doesn't have to be representative at all. But for me, these conferences in smaller and medium-sized formats are extremely helpful.
Britta, how about yourself? I mean, what role do think tanks play at the policy planning staff? You already alluded a little bit to it. What impact do they have? And also, I think it would be interesting. There are so many think tanks out there. How do you decide which ones to follow and which ones to look for? I mean, do you sign up for every newsletter?
No, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, it has a strong impact, and it has always been a strong impact, the work of think tanks in my work, not only now in the policy planning, but also before in my previous positions. Because, I mean, basically, think tankers do the work that you're supposed to do, but maybe not able to do due to your time constraints. But nevertheless, as a policymaker, you need to be always up to date on the political debates. You need to present recommendations, possible solutions to political problems. And then you're really, really lucky when you have a great think tank piece in your hand with really tailored, and I think that's really crucial, tailored recommendations for political goals that you can use, and you say, hey, yeah, great, that's exactly what I was looking for, but I just didn't have the time to think it through, or to compare it also to other suggestions and recommendations that might be there. So it's really crucial. And I mean, yeah, it's difficult. I of course I can't follow all of them, and I can't follow like every single policy brief, study, op-ed that is out there, although I would love to. Well, in my case, well, for me personally, it's really also about personal relationships. Mm-hmm. So people basically I know, people I talk to on a regular basis, people I meet for coffee, I meet for lunch, and then we have a conversation. And I think it's a two-way street also. It's not only that I meet people and say, hey, give me some genius ideas and then I can use them in my work. But I think it's also really, really crucial the other way around, that think tankers understand sometimes the complexity, sometimes ambiguities that there are in political decision making. It's not only about things that are maybe necessary or really important to do. Sometimes it's what is doable with regard to, you know, your piece in the government coalition. Maybe there's a heavy debate going on in a party basis, all of that are really crucial aspects on why certain ideas are realistic to be implemented or even not. I mean, if we like it or not, but that's the game. And I think it's really crucial also for think tankers to understand these little aspects, why something that might sound rational is just maybe not realistic to be implemented. And if once that is understood also from the other side, then I think it can be a really fruitful cooperation, because then you get your recommendations or solutions that are really, you know, for me, really a good basis to work with, because I can see, okay, they understood what's going on behind the scenes also, and maybe take it into account as well. So I think that's crucial. And as Joe Biden once said, all foreign policy is the extension of personal relationships. I think that is also really true for the cooperation between think tanks and policymakers. And basically that's it. Or maybe to just at one point also, debates on Twitter, for example, social media. I think it's really crucial, or at least that's true for me, that when I see there's a debate going on Twitter on a certain think tank piece, then of course there's immediately a mental note to myself, I have to read that, or I have to read that now or later, but I have to read it. So I think you shouldn't underestimate also the debates on social media and out there.
This is something I'm taking away from both of you. I mean, Graf Lambsdorff, you mentioned conferences, events, small round tables. So again, you know, highlighting the personal relationship. Britta, you mentioned the personal relationship. But how do you get to those personal relationships? Do you seek out think tanks? Do you contact an expert or contact somebody where you're like, oh, I like your op-ed that you wrote, let's meet and discuss? Or do you encourage think tankers to reach out to you? Or is it just you meet randomly at an event and then get to know each other? I mean, that'd be interesting to find out. Graf Lambsdorff.
In my case, it's mostly the latter, really. Because the good thing, I mean, Britta just said something that was really nice. I mean, it's I really enjoyed that, because the think tankers do the work that we are supposed to be doing but can't, and that is thinking, because we're always coordinating, scheduling meetings, running from this party thing to that party thing to this parliamentary thing so. When you go to a conference, when you take time out from this schedule where really activity crowds out the thinking part, in these conferences it's like a break. You take a break and you actually get to do what you once always wanted to do when you started out in this career as a diplomat or as a politician. You start to think about policy, and therefore these conferences really do matter. And that's where, at least for me, speaking just for me, is where you meet people, where you get to talk to people, where all of a sudden you hear about organizations that you had no idea existed, but who do really interesting work. And so that's something that I appreciate a great deal. I rarely have the opportunity to seek out people actively. Because I have so much. I mean, this sounds a little bit pompous, but our schedules are slightly crazy. It's a reality. It's I don't want to sound self-important here, but the scheduling is an issue, and so seeking out additional appointments with people who might have something interesting to say happens rather rarely, frankly speaking.
What about you, Britta? You agree with that, or
yeah,
do you have a different way?
I mean, the case of Alexander Graf Lambsdorff is really completely different, and his daily work, of course, from mine. So in my case, it's much more still. Sometimes I'm reaching out to people. Yes, I do, but sometimes, or in many cases, I would say it's a contact or an introduction via another person I already know. So when I'm talking to a friend of mine, think tanker, I don't know, and we are discussing a certain issue, and then we're talking about, I don't know, some technological aspects or digital sovereignty or whatever, and I was like, I'm not really, too much of an expert on that area. And then she or he say, hey, do you know that person who is really great and who had that piece there and there, and I just connect you. So sometimes it's just really, a network that is built up through people you already know. And some think tankers, and I really, really appreciate that, just reach out also to me and say, hey, this is me, this is my organization or my think tank, and we are specializing on that and that issue. And if you're interested, let's meet for coffee. Here you can find more information and so on. So I think it's really, really valuable. But of course, also, as was said before, the gatherings, the conferences, I mean, that is the perfect place to meet people and also to have a concentrated focus there on the debates that are going on.
Graf Lambsdorff, you mentioned that you now have staff to read think tank papers. Do you sometimes read think tank papers yourself? And if so, then what would it take for you to read it?
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask, do you read at all? Well, I do read occasionally. But frankly speaking, most of the reading is done indeed by my staff. But when there is an interesting study, and if it's not too long, for example, the SWP has these policy briefs that are short and compact and snappy. That's something that you can read. It's 2 to 4 pages. That's something I read. Then there's a couple of products that I look forward to. For example, the again, I'm sorry for mentioning the SWP so much, but it's the one that I look at most. They have these papers on very unlikely scenarios, extrapolations with scenarios. Like the breaking up of Saudi Arabia, for example. What would that mean? It's something like this. You don't think about it every day, but it's not completely out of the question. So this is something that. And then there's one thing I don't get any promotions. This is my printed think tank that I read once a month. It's The Atlantic. It's by far the best publication. It's like a Forrest Gump would say, it's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. But it's really brilliant writing, and Applebaum writes there, David Frum, so many other people, and they bring up topics that appear in Germany like 6 to 9 months later. And so The Atlantic, for me, is when you ask, do you read think tank papers? Well, technically, that's not a think tank paper, but it has the quality and the depth of think tank papers. There was the seminal essay by Anne Applebaum about the sort of the nature of complicity, talking about the Republican Party and Donald Trump, starting out with German communists in exile in the Hotel Lux in Moscow in the 1930s. I mean, it's stuff like that I find is absolutely fascinating. But this is not strictly speaking think tank work. But when you ask, what do I read in terms of think tanks? Short, snappy papers that are interesting. Stuff I come across on Twitter, if it turns out to be readable, just as Britta just said, that I do read, and then The Atlantic, which is my box of chocolates kind of think tank thing.
Fantastic. What about you, Britta? I mean, and also would be interested to find out what frustrates you the most when reading a think tank policy paper. That was one of the questions that comes up. Is there something that really frustrates you when you read some think tank products?
Well, I think frustrates me is maybe a little too much. I hope that I don't get frustrated by think tank work, so that would be quite poor. But well, kidding aside, I would say, you know, if there's lengthy analysis, maybe without any concrete recommendations, that can still be interesting, but in a way, you know, with so many time constraints that we have here, I would really appreciate always having like really concrete output and proposals. It may not be the one truth, you know, that is out there, but at least, you know, on a concrete basis that we can work on. Or what also frustrates me a little bit is maybe if there are, you know, recommendations that are like coming out of the playbook of an ideal world, I would say. It's nice, it's interesting, but sometimes I think, you know, on some texts you can really see, okay, the author may not be too much into, as I said before, these whole political complexities that are going on there behind the scenes. You can really see that if someone gets it, if someone has knowledge on what is going on, for example, in our political realm in Berlin, or not. And if it's just what would be the ideal way to do, then, as I said, it's nice, but you can't really work with it in our job.
We're now coming to the last segment, which is on the think tank impact. And let me start with you, Britta. How you mentioned the need for concrete policy recommendations. How do you use these concrete policy recommendations? Do you, I don't know, in the range of the jobs that you had, you know, working for members of parliament, now working in the foreign policy planning staff, how do you use that?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's, of course, it's food of thought, as I said, just to have information or ideas that you can think about. That I would say it's like the first step, which is good. But I also had, I mean, in the past, like when I was reading a text and there was a really good and catchy phrase, or maybe a really interesting metaphor or image or something like that, then I also started to put it into a speech or an article, of course, always referring to the source, never without referring to the source. But also, well, for example, if I may mention an example, it was the great piece, I think, at the beginning of March of this month by Sophia Besch and Sarah Brockmeier, who wrote Waking a Sleeping Giant, What's Next for German Security Policy. I think it was a really great piece because it just had a clear and really readable language. It had a clear structure and it addressed so many aspects that I was already starting to think about, but then it was written there in front of me and I thought, that it is so true what they've written. And there was a part on European defense capabilities. It was about if Europe should, you know, invest in common European defense at the cost of longer development times, or if they should fill the gaps, the military capability gaps now on the cost of a common European defense industry. And I think that is also really a crucial decision that we have to make in European defense questions. So I added that, for example, this information or thought into a briefing for the minister, because I found it relevant. If it stays there or not, that's on another page. But I mean, at least, I try to integrate it. And also to give a little credit to today's facilitator, Roderick, I remember a piece written by you in 2020, yes, on a US and German approach on China. And there you had this really catchy phrase, while the US was the world's policeman, Germany became the world's salesman. And I loved that so much because it was so short and everyone knew what you were talking about and what was meant by it. So I also used that in some briefings or speeches or so.
Thank you, Britta. That's very kind. It's really nice to see that some of these things that, that think tankers do for a living and write are actually also being used in practical real life. Graf Lambsdorff, question to you that we had, maybe a bit controversial, but did a think tanker ever change your opinion on a topic?
I would hope so. I mean, I've read many texts, but can I come back to what Britta just said about this Besch-Brockmeyer piece? Just to give you an example that your work does have impact. The foreign policy spokesman for my political group, the guy who chairs our team on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag, he came back from a conference in Vilnius. And he reported back that it was such a sensation because a Swedish researcher said, the giant is finally awoken. awoken. And everybody around the table was, what did they say? And then he made, he gave this speech, and it was half of the article written by Besch-Brockmeyer, which was reported by a Swedish contributor to a conference in Vilnius, to which the German parliamentarian went. So sometimes it goes in funny, in funny lines, but it clearly had an impact because this idea that after the speech, that after Olaf Scholz's speech there on the 27th of February, something had really changed, and this Zeitenwende business is now on, and how it's going to. It really did have an impact, and he was totally impressed coming back from that conference and having heard about this. So there is impact. Has anybody ever changed my mind? I would hope so. I couldn't pick a topic now where I would say that I would have to think about that. Let me think a little bit about it, but I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. I just can't tell you how and where and why.
No problem at all. All right, well, this comes to the end of the interview segments that we have. We're now opening up the floor for questions, either in the chat or raise your hand. Our first hand raised, Ronja, I'll already pass the floor to you, and that gives me time to look at the chat for more questions. Ronja, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Roderick. And also thank you to Britta Jacob and Alexander Lambsdorff. That's been super fascinating and very, very helpful for our work. My name is Ronja Scheler. I'm a program director with Körber Stiftung in Berlin. So we're a private foundation, not classically a think tank, but we also try to make some sort of relevant impulses to foreign policy making. And well, one question I always have in mind concerns timing, because sometimes I feel that there is a mismatch between the political processes that are ongoing and the times when think tankers provide their papers or their input. And I wonder, like, for instance, about the coalition negotiations, when are parties preparing their foreign policy chapter? So when's the moment to provide something? National security strategy, when's the window of opportunity to come in? And I think, I just wonder how we can do better on this, because in the end, this will be a win-win for the recipients to receive the stuff at the right time and for us, the providers, to provide it at the right time. And then secondly, if I may, there's one thing that stuck with me at one point that Robert Niblett made in the context of the think tank lab. I'm not sure if it was in written or in spoken form, but he said if think tanks try to be too policy relevant, they become irrelevant because it's too concrete or too specific and not out of the box thinking. And I always wonder whether it's more useful for you as recipients to receive something that addresses a specific problem you have and you get an answer that's very policy specific in a way, or whether it's more helpful to be provided with something, out of the box thinking, and where you say, hey, well, I have not thought about this and this has more impact on my work. That would be two things I had in mind. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ronja. Britta, do you want to start maybe also on the timing, when's best for think tanks to, bring their products to you?
That is a really, really tough and very good question, I would say. Well, I think it's basically, I think it's connected, not only the timing, but the timing and the certain product you provide. Because, well, or just to give you an example, now with the war going on in Ukraine, Also a certain think tank that was mentioned also already many times, so I can't mention it again, or well, the SVP does have like, they immediately established a format that was, you know, from Monday to Friday, every morning at 8 o'clock, from 8 to 9 or something like that. So before your really busy day starts, and they just put in like a certain aspect of the war in Ukraine. So be it on migration, be it on security and defense, be it on energy supplies, you name it. And they established it immediately, like a few days after the war was going on. And we were like, okay, that is really nice. That is really easy also for us. You just click on a link. It's a digital debate. Then you have 3 experts gathered there. It's moderated, and you can ask your questions and you get like immediate input. And I think in times like these, in a crisis, you know, when here at the Foreign Office, I mean, everyone is like really super busy now with handling the crisis, but something like that is still very good to digest and also to work on it. I don't know if, although it's still, you know, the timing would be, okay, I focus on the crisis, but if then you get 10 pages paper on what is going on, I don't know if you would really like have the time to read all of that. So it's timing, but it's also the ways of, or the formats that you choose to address policymakers in a certain phase. And when it comes to, well, the national security strategy, I can maybe tell you a little bit that I mean, it's not only on think tanks to see, okay, when can we get in there and when can we contribute? But I think that is really, really good, the way that we are now establishing the process, that in that case, the government or the German Foreign Office is reaching out to think tanks. And that is what will start now until summer. That we will reach out to think tanks and have smaller events or bigger events, and then discuss certain issues that will come up there in the national security strategy. And as far as parties are concerned, well, that is another thing. Maybe when do they really put together their foreign policy content? I would say it's already basically in the phase when they write their policy platforms, right, and programs, and then it's discussed again with a party basis. So there will be a lot of change then again. It's not only about, you know, writing a program and maybe putting some really important think tank thoughts in it, but then you have the political debate, and that is the very difficult side maybe of such a thing, but then it has to be much earlier. So just to give you a little assessment on how I see it, that it's really timing and product and formats that you have to choose wisely.
How about you, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff? I remember you said the Atlantic always is 6 months to 1 year ahead of Germany. So what about timing here in German think tanks?
I think what Britta just said is absolutely right. If you want to influence political processes in Germany, look at the rhythm that the parties have. And the parties begin to prepare their federal election 24 months prior to that election. That's when programmatic work starts. That's when candidates vie for position. That's when lists are being discussed. It takes about a year for all of that to be finished. But it's that time frame. So the third year of a legislature is the time when you can actually influence political parties. Now, the question that you've asked is, of course, the perennial question for all think tanks. Do you want to be, you know, ahead of the curve and do, you know, provide original thinking and not care so much about the day-to-day politics, or do you want to be more like a Politikberatung, a policy advisory organization? And there it's a little bit difficult, and there it can be absolutely, you know, day-to-day activity, you know, the policy breakfast or the brown bag lunch. In Washington, we've always had the so-called brown bag lunches. Bring your own lunch, gather around the table and discuss a topic with someone who has something to say, something interesting to contribute, and that then may influence really the daily work. So it's a little bit between these two extremes My general advice would be, but I'm not in a position to give advice, but if you're a real sort of academic think tank, don't bother so much about finding the exact time to provide the information, because if the ideas are good, they will make it to policymakers anyway, somehow, through journalists, for example, who write about your work. But it's a little bit something that every organization has to decide for themselves. And for example, the German Marshall Fund, in my view, is one of these great organizations that does both very well. And there are others, and there are also foundations that do it in a particular way in one period of time and stop doing it in another period of time. I see Werner Weidenfeld here. Bertelsmann used to be one of the foreign policy platforms 20 years ago. Today, I don't notice much coming from Bertelsmann because they've chosen different priorities. That's also fine. That's not our business. But depending on where you want to position yourself, I think the quality of ideas matters more than the delivery of the mechanism of their delivery.
Thank you. We have Cornelius Adebar, and then I think Christoph Bertram also wanted to come in. But Cornelius, you come.
Thank you very much, Roderick, and thanks to the two speakers for a fascinating conversation, and also thanks to the Think Tank Lab team for putting this together. This is really useful. I would like to start with a very short anecdote and then come to my question, which is really in the present, which is about Zeitenwende. And the anecdote is the first time I came in touch with a think tank product was a report by the Aspen Institute called Unfinished Peace, written, and Alexander knows it, written after the Bosnia War. And I got to read it after the Kosovo War had started. I read through this and I realized that, well, it was all out there. Everyone knew what needed to be done to prevent the second war from erupting, but politicians didn't act. So it was quite frustrating, I have to say. But this is how life goes, especially if you're on the analyst and consultancy side. But this leads me to the question for today for Zeitenwende, because I would really like to know how the two of you, how do you see this momentum for Germany developing? How do you want to gestalten? How do you want to shape the Zeitenwende? What is the role of think tanks? Do we have the ideas already out there? Has there been enough innovative thinking? Do you just need to pull some things or some people together and get this over and done with quickly? Or is this a long process, a year or two? How do you envisage this interlinkage between the policy making and think tanks when it comes to Zeitenwende? Thank you.
This sounds like a question for another Think Tank Lab lunch talk, but I'll give it straight up to Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, please.
Yeah, well, Zeitenwende, by the way, used in the context that we use it right now, is also the product of a think tank. It comes from the MSC 2020 report. So we are all sort of, the puppets of the think tanks here in policy making. I think what needs to happen now is hardening the notion of Zeitenwende. It needs to be. It's like liquid concrete. It's out there, but it's not solid yet. Many people are already, falling back in their old patterns of Pollyannish rhetoric and trying to soften the idea. I think we have, and that may be a coincidence, but maybe not. If you look at the coalition agreement, what you'll find is, particularly in foreign policy chapter, and Britta and I know that quite well, you find enough substance there to actually achieve that, the hardening of the ideas behind the Zeitenwende as proposed by Scholz and Baerbock. It's really, it's there. You can actually do it with this coalition agreement. And I think this is what needs to be done now. This is a matter of political leadership. The policymakers now need to be out there and be very clear about the fact that this is not a fad, that is not an ephemeral kind of situation that we're faced with, but it is indeed a new time, a new period that we're entering, and that Germany needs to live up to.
Yeah, I also do think it's a really big chance and opportunity. It's sad that we had to have this this disruptive event happening. But I think it's really an opportunity. And as Alexander Graf Lambsdorff just said, I mean, it was, or it is the approach of this new government and also of the coalition treaty to have a fundamental change also in the way we do politics and have a more active and engaged Germany and Europe. So all of that was already in it before, but now we have, like, sadly, this event that makes us see it so clearly that things have to change and that we have to be a more responsible and active player there. On the other hand, I have to say, I'm also a little, I fear, well, the same as Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, that people are now, maybe again falling a little in old patterns and maybe, hesitating a little bit or questioning, oh, is it really good to have now this shift, this complete shift over there? I think it can be an opportunity. But what you also have to take into consideration is really, we had such a long phase of quite an, at least for foreign and security policy, but also on energy and climate policy, I'd say, of quite an inactive and hesitating policy. And now we had this shift basically by one speech of the Chancellor in the Bundestag, and everyone's like, oh, we have the Zeitenwende now, so where is it, like, tomorrow? And you're like, it was like 16 years or even more, the way to where we are now. This was such a long phase. It can't be done like in a day. We need really patience on that, but still also a passion and the political will to go that way. And you can see it now. I mean, as far as energy security is concerned, and our Minister for Economic Affairs now struggling to, okay, how can I diversify our energy supply chains? How can we get more independent on fossil fuels? And it's not that easy. Of course, it's not that easy. And that, again, there are experts and think tanks saying, hey, but this has to be done and it's easy, you can do it, and German economy can really take it, that we will have, some difficulties. And there are others saying, be careful, this can be so many harsh consequences that you might not overlook now. You really have to balance it out. So this is just an example to see, okay, yeah, Zeitenwende, but it's said very easily, but what it really means to have such a shift on the long run, that is really, really difficult. And I just hope that people don't lose the political will and their decisive work on that, that we can really achieve the goal we all have, I would say.
Absolutely. I got 3 questions from the chat, but Christoph Bertram, if I'm not mistaken, wanted to come in as well.
Right. Well, I'm very grateful to be able to take part in this exciting discussion. I'm one of the co-authors of the study that we brought out for Bush and Mercator. Some of you may remember it, in which well before the MSC, we were pointing out that there is a real change in the world and think tanks better start looking at it and concentrating on it. But I don't want to just to say that we were there first. It's always nice to remember, one of us remembers it, and that's why I'm making this point. But basically, my question is to both the practitioners we've had here and to the think tanks. One of the findings we had in asking all sorts of people in politics and government in the think tanks was that think tanks don't go out and get in touch with people in the world of practical policy decision and ask them, what is it you want from us? And those in the world of practical policy making so far don't go out to think tanks and say, look, this is a question we have. We'd like to talk to you about it, or at least keep some thought of it. I remember talking to a very eminent politician in this group, and he said, well, I've got all these studies here, and I don't read them. My staff reads them. And I said, well, and I don't really need them. I said, well, why don't you start criticizing them? Why don't you start getting in touch with these people and say, look, what you do and what you produce is not of interest to me. This is what would be of interest to me. And just imagine how long was that we had 120,000, 150,000 Russian forces around Ukraine. It wasn't just a few weeks. It was months and months and months on end. Which think tank actually sat down and said, let's just think about the consequences. And we were all very good, think tanks were very good in reacting, but very, very, very unimpressive in saying something is coming along. And we all know the world is changing. Where are the think tanks looking at and helping politicians to understand it? So I hope that practitioners are going to be more critical and also more demanding. And I hope that the think tanks are really going to also work harder to find out where we go views. Because otherwise we just continue to work into separate compartments and hope that somehow something will fly over from one compartment to the other.
I agree. I mean, what Christoph Bertram just said, I think I have to say though, that I believe think tanks very often are more ahead of the curve, and I'm sorry for being so blunt here, than journalists. I mean, if you look at the Trielle during the election campaign, no question about foreign policy whatsoever, nothing. If you look at the Sommer interviews that are being done with the party leaders, I made my staff, I wrote a book last year, I made my staff count the questions that were asked on foreign policy. So they were, don't fix me on the precise figure, it was 162 questions, out of which 8 were on foreign policy, 6 of them were to the then defense minister. I mean, journalism in Berlin is as provincial as it gets. I think the think tank community is much more outward-looking and also much more forward-looking. And I wouldn't sort of, agree with that critical an outlook on the think tank landscape. It's more the journalistic landscape, which I find totally surprising, because many of the journalists who come to Berlin used to be correspondents abroad. But then they fall into this Berlin, I don't know, climate, and that's where the debates are really lacking, and that's what I find regrettable. Not so much the think tank community.
Look at it the complete same way, and that maybe although there might be some real smart experts and think tanks, like foreseeing in a way a little bit also developments, or maybe when they might have said, hey, there's a gathering of so many troops on the Russian-Ukraine border, maybe something's coming up and this could be the scenario. And they approached the policymakers, but still for policymaking, you need a certain momentum. And how do you have that momentum? You have that by also public debate and pressure from the media, let's say, to put certain news out there, to have a debate. And then you can engage, and then you can bring forward your solutions. If it's not even on the table of public debate, I can try, as a policymaker, as an active politician, to maybe address all of these issues. But will it be somehow reflected? Will it be written about? Will it be asked about in interviews? I doubt that. So I think that also goes hand in hand, basically. People who foresee or analyze certain developments early on as an early warning, but also journalists who are really also interested in these issues and take it up, and then you can have the political pressure and the will to act. But without that, it's really difficult.
Can I come back to one of your earlier questions, Roderick? Because on this very particular question, I think there's one thing that you asked, what frustrates you about the think tank community? What I find frustrating about the think tank landscape, but it's a very German thing, is the complete absence of military competence. We have so many Friedensinstitute and Friedensforschungsinstitute and Friedensforschungsinstitute. I don't mind them at all, and the work they do is important. And I've read HSFK and Harald Müller's stuff, and Ernst Otto Czempil was one of my professors. But we have no military competence in our universities, because it's actually outlawed in many Bundesländer to have anything military as part of university studies. And I think that's a mistake. We have 130,000 troops amassing around Ukraine, and we have nobody who's capable of recognizing and communicating the dangers that come along with this from the academic or the think tank community. That's a serious, I believe, a serious problem, because the world that we're entering is one in which war, in whichever way, shape, or form, will continue to play a role. And so I think that's one frustrating aspect, not concerning the work that all of you do, but there's a hole, I think, in our think tank landscape here.
That's a good point. We have 3 minutes left. And I'm willing to go maybe a couple more minutes overboard, but let's try to constrain it now because I got 4 more questions from the chat. I'm going to give you 2 rapid fire questions where I would hope to have quick answers. And then we have another 2 questions that maybe you give a little bit more, have a little bit more time for. The 2 rapid fire questions would be, the first one is, what's more important to you, think tank research or the convening power of think tanks?
Both.
Both. Britta?
Both.
Both. Okay. Which communication channel do you use to access or find out about think tank products? Is it LinkedIn, Twitter, newsletters, mailings, an op-ed?
Twitter. In my case, it's mostly Twitter.
Okay, I would also say Twitter and mailings maybe, but Twitter far more.
Okay, Twitter. Then we have a question from Jennifer Hecht, our colleague from the Stiftung Mercator. How can think tanks in Germany have more impact? What do they need to do to be more impactful?
I mean, Britta may correct me if she thinks that I'm wrong, but I think the impact has greatly improved. Berlin now has, I mean, I mentioned, you know, my early experiences in DC in the 90s, where you had this paradise for policy wonks. Berlin now starts to resemble that a little bit. I mean, there's so many new players and interesting players and or old players who have opened offices in Berlin. Brussels was a little bit ahead of Berlin, but now Berlin is up there with Brussels, not quite where DC is, but it's interesting. So I think the impact is there. And at the end of the day, it's really what Anne Flotolier mentioned. It's the quality of ideas and it's the convening power that both, you know, help, you know, propel ideas into action. One thing, and that's not your responsibility as the think tank community, I think the German political structures should be more open to this revolving door, to have people from the think tank community participate for 2-3 years in policy work and then go back to their think tank. And they shouldn't be then tainted by having worked for the CDU or the FDP or the Greens. They should still be respected as independent scholars and thinkers. That is something that we're quite bad at.
I can completely agree. I would also say they already have an impact, but I would see that as a bigger, you know, a problem of our system as a whole. And what Alexander Graf Lambsdorff said before, it's not only think tanks, but also I would say it again, the role of media, but also look at our conversations or debates in the German parliament. Where do we have our security and defense policy debates, like let's say on a regular basis, where it's completely normal to talk about why we need our military for what task, and what about our capabilities, and what's our strategic also interest, you know, security and defense wise. We don't really have that because we're still quite reluctant to that. So I'd say it's a problem of the whole system. And then also what was said on, for example, how we let people in also in our governing system. I can also see that a little bit now as a newcomer, but to the German Foreign Office, for example. And if I compare that to State Department in the United States, for example, where people, experts, are going there, working like maybe a few years there, then going back to some think tanks, going abroad somewhere, but they really use this expertise. And in our case, I would say in Germany, it's still, you know, every area for itself. And I think that is a mistake. We have to, be much more cooperate on these issues, also in the structures.
We run out of time, but I still want to ask one last question, because I think it's a nice follow-up question from the points that Christoph Bertram made. When Christoph Bertram was saying, what about this critical exchange between policymakers and think tanks, where you can say, look, this is not working for me, or you need to change this and this and this. The question from the head of the think tank lab, Claire Lucia Leifert, is what format could allow for such an open, honest exchange?
The one that I mentioned early on as one of the most productive conferences. It was a format, 30, 40 people maximum around the table, 3-4 countries, Brookings, SWP, Chatham House, and I think Dominique Moissy's outfit, I forget the name, Institut de Relations Internationales, I think. Small, Chatham House, public, is somewhere away, and then you can actually speak very openly. There are a few formats like this. For example, Wilton Park conferences work that way. Aspen sometimes has retreats like this. So these are things that I find really helpful when you can actually challenge each other openly without having to fear that it's in the public domain a couple of days later. Can I just add one thing, Roderick, because Adrian Woltersdorf just put something in the chat, and I have not been precise enough. I don't mean to be critical of the journalists, but it's the media. And you're right for saying it's not the journalists, it's the media organizations, the media outlets that dial down foreign policy issues. So point taken, I was not quite precise enough. Thank you very much for correcting me.
Britta, and also to specify, this exchange being like a critical exchange on think tanking and the products, the organizational issues and so forth.
Well, I would say it's, and again, and I mean, I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but based on this personal relationship and exchange, and if I have a safe space, and that would mean like a one-on-one, but maybe, or just a small circle of people where I can really be honest and open, or we can be honest and open with each other, then I could say, hey, that was nice or interesting or whatever, but it wasn't really useful for me. Or, hey, I'm a policymaker, I'm not a PhD candidate. That is really interesting what you write. It's an academic piece maybe, but I now want to tell you what I need, what is the best thing to work with. And I want you also to enable you to have that output by explaining to you a little bit what are the complexities, what is going on behind the scenes. So as I said before, this two-way street. And I think once you have established that, then you can also be open with your critique and also vice versa, of course, that also think tanks say, hey, but we gave all of that, to you, and what are you doing? Or that's the wrong way. I think it has to be both ways, but clearly personal relationships is just indispensable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I remember one of the first things both of you said was busy schedules, not a lot of time. I'm afraid we've already taken 5 more minutes out of those busy schedules. But let me just thank you again for joining us for today's discussion. I think this was lots of food for thought, lots to think about, lots to take away. This discussion is not going to end here. I think it's the beginning of something. But thank you again, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff. Thank you, Britta. Thank you to all the participants who have sent in questions, who put questions in the chat, who joined us in the discussion. We have recorded this event, will be online in the coming weeks. And again, if you're interested in what the Think Tank Lab is doing, look on the website, join us on Twitter. We'll keep this discussion going. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.